to introduce our speaker.
Namaste and Tashi Dele. It's a great pleasure to welcome the world's only hybrid Tibetan Mongolian American cowboy to the Oakmont Symposium with a traditional Tibetan ceremonial scarf. George, can you put me back on for 1 second?
Sure.
We've got a virtual welcome going here that requires me to be seen.
I'm having trouble doing that.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
There you are. You're back on.
All right. Okay. So, Tashidele. Daniel Miller has been my friend and sometimes colleague in international research and development for 43 years. We first met when he came to Nepal as a Peace Corps volunteer, where he learned Nepali and Tibetan. He then worked as a cowboy on ranches in Montana and completed his master's from the University of Montana in forestry with an emphasis on rangeland ecology. In addition to decades of professional and personal interactions in Nepal, I've had the pleasure to meet him in Tibet when he was researching wild yaks with George Schaller, and we had to drink Mount Tais together. In Kabul, in a reinforced shipping container on the US Embassy compound during his many years with the United States Agency for International Development. In Washington, DC, in his home there and in his home in New Delhi, and in the yard of his current retirement home in Buffalo, Wyoming last summer. Dan has published numerous scientific articles about Tibetan and Mongolian nomads, beautiful photography books, and is currently working on a memoir entitled A Cowboy in Mongolia. He's also a collector of Tibetan and Mongolian rugs and textiles, as is a fellow Zoom participant here, Ian Alsop, and has lectured at the Textile Museum in Washington, DC. So maybe we can get him to do a presentation on Tibetan rugs and weaving sometime. Dan, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Gabriel. The title of my talk today is Cowboys and Nomads Living with Livestock, where basically I'm going to discuss the similarities between these different livestock raising cultures that has fascinated me for many years, most of my professional life. I was struck by the similarities between the cowboys of Montana and Wyoming that I have worked with and the nomads of the Himalaya, Tibet, Nepal, Bhutan, and the Tibetan areas themselves, and also Mongolia. They all raise livestock, they living on the rangelands, and they share many things similar in terms of their challenges they face today. So this is kind of a summary of 30, 40 years of experience with ranchers and cowboys and cowgirls and the nomads in these areas. There is a real, you might say, a respect for the land that is used by both the ranchers in the US and the nomads, because that's what their lives depend upon. And being out in all types of weather, taking care of their animals takes remarkable skills and knowledge that is oftentimes not well recognized. Once when I was living in New Delhi in the embassy, they asked me, they heard that I had worked as a cowboy, and they asked me to give a presentation about American cowboys. So I did, and then the person in the public affairs office said, "Oh, well, can you wear your cowboy costume also?" Which I thought was kind of interesting, because I was surprised at the lack of knowledge, even of Americans, with the ranching tradition in the US. So a little bit of background on how I ended up getting where I'm at today to be able to talk to you is I was raised on a dairy farm in Minnesota. We also raise sheep, and that's a picture of me with my grand champion lamb at our county 4-H show. And then I went to the Peace Corps. I was in Nepal. I spent 3 months in Kathmandu learning to speak Nepali. And then I was sent to a village. I had to walk for a week to get there. And when I got there, nobody spoke Nepali. They all spoke Tibetan. They were yak herders. So I spent almost 4 years in Nepal herding yaks as a Peace Corps volunteer. And that's a picture of me there at the top middle with a Tibetan speaking yak herder. And after those 4 years, I decided that, I'm interested in spending more time with these nomads in the Himalaya or Tibet. And perhaps I could capitalize on my agricultural background, having been raised on a dairy farm. But I decided I needed to get more practical experience. So I went to Montana and worked as a cowboy for many years before eventually going back to finish a bachelor's degree in Wisconsin, and then started grad school in Montana. And then after spending 5 years in the States, I knew I had to get back to Nepal sometime or somehow. So I wasn't making any money as a cowboy, as a graduate student, but I got to Nepal to lead treks. And so then I started working in leading treks and working on as consultant on development projects, and ended up working in Nepal and Bhutan, and then working in China and Tibet, and started doing research on wild yaks in Tibet for a PhD, which unfortunately I never finished. But and then when I was 50 years old, I'm talking to friends of mine and they're talking about retiring. And I thought, well, I better find a real job. And U.S. Agency for International Development hired me and sent me to Afghanistan. So I spent almost 15 years as a diplomat working in embassies for USAID, was an agricultural officer. And then in August 2017, I retired and went to Mongolia and worked with herders for most of the last 3 years. And now for the last year, I've been living in Wyoming, where I now use my base. I continue to do consulting work for the World Bank in Mongolia, even though I can't travel there, and spend time with ranchers and cowboys here in Wyoming and Montana. So kind of full circle. Started off milking cows every morning, and I still get up early in the morning. A little bit of geography is important so that we understand where we're at. This is actually a NASA-derived satellite image of the Tibetan Plateau. This is the Tibetan Plateau. This is the plains of India. This is the Himalayan mountains. This is the Taklamakan Desert. And then it goes across into the Gobi Desert, which is northwestern China and southern Mongolia. This is Mongolia up here, and you see this large lake towards the top is Lake Baikal. And then the Altai Mountains, the western boundary with China and Kazakhstan. And so then this is the steppes of Mongolia. So I purposely did not put any politically drawn boundary lines on this map because I think it's important that we look at areas with the view of, looking at in terms of watersheds. Here's another view, kind of a different look from the southeast, looking northwest across the Indian plains. We got the Bay of Bengal, there's India, the Himalaya across here, Bhutan is there, there's Nepal across through there. And this is the Tibetan Plateau, and then the Taklamakan Desert up there, and then Mongolia starting up here. So I think these images give you a better sense of the lay of the land and the kind of country that I'm going to be showing pictures of. So this talk is really about the grassland environment and the rangelands and the similarities between Mongolia, as we see here in this picture, with the felt round tent. We normally call it a yurt, but the Mongolian word is a gir. Yurt is actually a Russian word. And the contrast with the rangelands in Montana. This is actually eastern Montana on the Crow Indian Reservation. This photograph was taken in June 2019 when it had been a fabulous year for the growth of yellow sweet clover. That you see all these yellow flowers are sweet clover blooming in June. But a lot of similarities with big wide open country and big blue skies. A little bit of more history. This is actually from Mongolia. These are called deer stones.
Dan, you want to be on hold a minute?
Yep.
We had someone post that they were having difficulty seeing the screen. Is that universal, or is that just one person?
I can see it.
Okay.
I can see it too. You need to have your view on
I can see
side
it.
by side speaker.
Okay, everybody can see it except us. One person needs to put their screen on side by side. Okay, thank you very much. You're back on, Dan.
So this is from Mongolia. It's called deer stones because you see a stylized elk known as a deer stone. Sometimes these are 2-3 meters tall. These are 3,000 years old, made by the early nomad tribes in Mongolia. These are probably grave sites where important leaders were buried. This is the real difference between the American current ranching culture and the nomads in Tibet and Mongolia is this long pastoral history in both Mongolia and Tibet, really exhibited by these, deer stones to these structures. You also find in Mongolia and in Tibet rock petroglyphs in places. And I'm sitting next to one of these areas in the Gobi Desert with all of these rocks, this art pecked into the rock that was made probably 3,000 years ago also. Another feature you see across Mongolia are these large mound graves. The Mongolian word is hiriksur. Some of these rock mounds are, 15, 30 feet tall, and then there's usually a circle of rocks around it, and then further out, another circle of small piles of rocks with oftentimes horse skulls buried in them. These would be graves of important people or elder leaders. And when you're going across this country now and you see it, and you come into these mounds or these deer stones, and you think, my goodness, it took incredible social organization for these tribes to organize the labor to build these structures at the time. So it's, I think, quite interesting that as you're going across this country, you still see these signs of nomads that used the place thousands and thousands of years ago. This is the Potala Palace in Lhasa that was built in the 14th, 15th century. It was the home of the Dalai Lama, or all the Dalai Lamas. The current Dalai Lama, the 14th, left it in 1959. It's important to remember that Tibet also had a long history. I mean, Tibet had a written language starting in the 7th or 8th century. In 763, the Tibetan Empire at the time sacked the Tang Dynasty capital in Chang'an, and they controlled the Silk Route for many centuries as well. This is a NASA-derived visualization of the Tibetan Plateau, where you see the Bay of Bengal, the plains of India, the Himalaya, and the Tibetan Plateau. And there's a 9th century poem describing Tibet that I think is really beautiful. It says, "The core of the earth, this heart of the world, fenced around by snow, the headland of all rivers, where the mountains are high and the land is pure, a country so good, where men are born as sages and heroes and act according to good laws, a land of horses ever so speedy." So that was written in the 9th century. And you can certainly see that it is ringed by mountains. That gives you a sense of the long history of these areas that we're dealing with. Now, many people when you hear about Mongolia, say, oh yeah, well, Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan came to power in the 13th century, early 1200s. There had been previous nomadic empires on the Tibetan or on the Mongolian steppes before, but it was Genghis Khan that really solidified these different tribes and created the greatest land empire in Asia at the time. And even to this day, he is still revered by Mongolians. This is a large statue that's been constructed outside of the capital city where Genghis Khan is looking east towards his homeland. This is a photograph from Mongolia of the ancient Karakorum, which was Genghis Khan's capital during the 13th century. And there's still ruins in the area, and some early monasteries are found in this, behind these walls with these stupas in this area. Of course, Buddhism came from India into Tibet. The Mongolians adopted Buddhism in the 13th, 14th century as well. And so this permeates their culture and their thinking. And with a lot of the Mongolians and Tibetans, they still believe in shamanism and the spirit or power of mountains and rivers. There are numerous sacred mountains in both Tibet and Mongolia that people go on pilgrimage, that adds to their sense of the sacred that they have for the land. Now, in North America, of course, the Indian tribes lived there for thousands of years before white men settled the area. There's, certainly you look at the Tibetans or the Mongolians, they look very similar to the Cheyenne or the Sioux or the Arapaho or the Navajo Indians. But just to point out that before the rangelands in Mongolia or in the US started to be used by cattle, which is really only in the 1860s, 1870s, when the first cattle herds came into Wyoming and Montana with the demise of the extermination of buffalo herds, you had North American Indians using these areas, although they did not get the horse in the northern plains until about the late 1600s or early 1700s. So the plains Indian culture based on horses, not that long of a history compared to Mongolia and Tibet, where it lasted for thousands of years. This is from just outside of my hometown in Buffalo, open range. There is still large tracts of grassland, and this is one of these similarities between the grasslands of Montana and Mongolia and Tibet is large expanses of grassland. This is the open range in Mongolia, a little 2-lane dirt track going across the grassland. Very few fences, very few roads. Sometimes people would ask me, well, what's Mongolia like? And I would say, well, picture driving from Billings to Denver, which is about 500 miles, just on a little dirt track or a gravel road and never coming across a fence. And you start to get a sense of the scale of the landscape and the fact that it's still very much unfenced or open range. Of course, Mongolia is famous for the horses, and here we have Mongolian horses out in a field or in a grassland these are Caragana shrubs. In many places, they're very similar to what looks like sagebrush steppe in Wyoming or Montana. Mongolians, of course, live in their felt yurt, the Mongolian word gear, which is a collapsible frame, so a very suitable habitation for when you have to move, when you're a nomad and you have to move seasonally. Pack it up, put it on the yaks or on the back of camels, and you move to the next camp. And actually, with a fire inside, it's actually fairly warm even in the winter. Another classic view of Mongolian rangeland with the nomads in western part of the country in the fall. So it's not green, it's dry, but with the nomad tent or the yurt and a little corral on the right and a horse tied up outside. This is a classic scene from the rangelands of Mongolia. These are the Prejuvsky's wild horse, which is a wild horse that was found throughout Mongolia and down into neighboring areas of China. It was exterminated or killed out in the last record in the wild was in the 1960s, but there was enough horses in zoos in Poland and East Germany that in 1992, they reintroduced the horse, this Prejuvsky's horse, back into Mongolia. It has a very short mane and tail, it kind of looks a bit like a mule in terms of its head and the shape, but they now have probably about 500 of these wild horses reintroduced into 3 or 4 different areas in Mongolia. There's also other wildlife on the grasslands. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of photographs, but I think these artistic representations done by Mongolians. Here on the top, we have the argali or the bighorn sheep. On the bottom, the Mongolian gazelle, which are still found in large herds, and they're a migratory animal. And then you have the elk that are represented in those deer stones. So now we kind of get into talking about the similarity between these livestock raising cultures. A Tibetan nomad woman on her horse with a child behind her on the back. And if you look closely, she's got a little puppy in her saddlebags. And then on the right, a American rancher woman carrying her child in front of her at the start of a rodeo. in, actually this was in Hardin, Montana a number of years ago. I spent many summers working on a large ranch that we'd still pull out a horse-drawn chuck wagon and a bed wagon. This is actually the bed wagon. The chuck wagon is underneath this tent. Live out in tents for 6 weeks, up every morning at 3:30, 4 o'clock, and horses saddled and riding across the prairie before the sun would even come up, and we'd brand anywhere from 100 to 300 calves every morning. Did that for 6 weeks. So you spend a lot of time outside. This is a nomad tent, Tibetan yak hair tent. And you see that the width of this material here is because of that's the width of the loom that they use to make this yak hair into tents. Of course, the cowboys in Montana and Wyoming throughout the American West have their summer festivals with rodeos. Mongolians and Tibetans also have their summer festivals where they feature horses and everybody comes on horseback. So this similarity between cultures and this really this love of horses that the people have. They have their own different styles of saddle making. This is a Western style cowboy saddle. Actually, it's a saddle that I had custom made to use in Mongolia, and it's still over in Mongolia now. And this is a Mongolian saddle. You see the wooden tree, large silver conchos on the side and on this seat here. And actually the other interesting thing, this is Tibetan textile that they use for covering the top of the tree with silver here on the front and in the back as well. So, you know, both cultures, the cowboys of America, the Mongolians, the Tibetans take great pride in their horse gear that they use. This is a bridle on an American horse, a snaffle bit. This is a rawhide bridle on a Mongolian horse. They also use a snaffle bit and they make their own rawhide. Another set of photographs juxtaposed showing a roundup camp out on eastern Montana and the Tibetan yak hair tent on the grasslands of Tibet. So once again, people that spend lots of time outside in the grassland and this appreciation you develop for the grasslands, the wildlife there, and these big blue skies. I mean, Montana is oftentimes, called, big sky country. Well, you get the big blue skies in Mongolia and Tibet as well. A cowboy from Montana here on the left on his horse, and a nomad in Mongolia riding a yak hybrid cross. He's actually got a snaffle bit through the mouth of it on the bridle. There is a certain sense of, a cavalier attitudes that cowboys have, and nomads have as well. It's kind of this sense of, when you spend time on horseback and you're able to handle animals, there's a certain sense of confidence that you have. You might call it arrogance, and it's exhibited by these different livestock raising people, even though they are different cultures. And despite the differences in culture and the different languages that they speak, I say that they all speak the same basic language. I mean, it's a language about the grasslands, it's a language about horses, it's a language about cattle. Someone once asked me, how good my Tibetan was. And I said, well, I can't have a philosophical conversation in Tibetan, but I can't in English either. But I can certainly talk to the herders and nomads about their horses and grasslands and cattle. Another set of photographs juxtaposing the Mongolian nomads at their summer festival on the left, and then the Montana cowboys at the rodeo demonstrating their roping skills. What has really amazed me about both the young cowboys and cowgirls in America and the young nomad children in Mongolia and in Tibet is their uncanny ability and skills to handle these horses. This little boy on the right, I visited his camp. It was like in October, and got there, and he hopped on this horse and just took off at a gallop to bring in the other horses. And I said, wow, this kid like he's been riding for a long time. No, he just started riding a few months ago. And then I'd mentioned, well, we have a saying in America called born on the back of a horse. And the Mongolians have a similar statement when they talk about a young child that's so good on a horse. This young lady here is actually from Wyoming at our local rodeo. And, there's one saying I said, I mean, it's like, get a horse and you ride it like you stole it. I mean, she's going off riding around the barrows at a full gallop on this big horse, and she was only 5 years old. So this ability that these young children have, both in America as well as in Mongolia and Tibet at a young age, is just remarkable. This is a photograph taken in the Tibetan region of Dopal in northern Nepal. Actually, this photograph was taken in 1978. So how many years ago is that? 22, 40 some years ago. As a Peace Corps volunteer, as I said, I had lived with Tibetan speaking yak herders in the central part of the country. And this area of Dopal was famous for, in the late 70s, as like the last bastion of pure Tibetan culture, because they were Tibetan speaking. It was a part of Tibet at one time. So, when I finished with my Peace Corps service, I decided, okay, we're going to go and visit this area. I mean, I thought that the worst that we could do is they would, if they catch us up there, because it was a restricted area. It was restricted because the CIA ran their operations out of here in the late 60s, helping Tibetan guerrillas. So we thought, okay, we forged our all over Nepal trekking permits. We thought if we get caught up here, the worst they can do is, deport us. So we were going to go back to America anyway. And it was fantastic to experience this culture in this area. One day we were going through this valley and we ran into a military patrol, Nepalese military patrol. I wasn't sure if they had heard about us. They were looking for us. But we were on horseback and they were on foot. So we made a getaway on horseback. I really felt like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid riding out of town in a cloud of dust. This is a nomad woman from northeastern Bhutan. I worked in Bhutan for a period of 7 years, working with herders and nomads there on livestock development projects. Probably one of the best photographs I ever took of nomad people. This lady just kind of captures, she's looking wherever you're at, she's always looking at you. But I think it also really exhibits the subtle beauty, striking beauty really, of these people. And you see a little child with its hand behind her, she's got on her back, and the jewelry, they wear coral and turquoise jewelry. Okay, I first went to Tibet in 1988 to do research on wild yaks for a PhD. And I have an article on my website. I call it Hunting the Wild Yak and Chasing Tibetan Wild Ass. Oops, I should say wild donkeys, as somebody reminded me. I have to be politically correct. I wasn't chasing Tibetan wild ass. I was chasing Tibetan wild donkeys. But these are wild yaks. And that's how I got my email address, wildyakman@gmail. Now, a lot of people see, Wild Yak Man. I go, no, it's Wild Yak Man. So I was, doing research on wild yaks and other wildlife on the Tibetan plateau, and then started working with nomads in Tibet as well. This is a photograph of Tibetan rangelands at 15,000 feet. And of course, a little inset photo here of the yak. Life would not be possible in Tibet without the yak. They also raise yaks in Mongolia. But, they get the meat, they get milk, they make the hair into ropes and blankets. Life centers around the yak in Tibet. Later, I did research under National Geographic funding with an anthropologist, where he was studying the Tibetan nomads and their, how they were living. And I was looking at the rangelands in this area. And this was a family portrait that was made in their summer camp. You see the tent behind it. Another photograph of a Tibetan nomad woman taken in Tibet. This photograph was taken in 1997. Looking right at you. This shows a Tibetan nomad yak hair tent. And again, you see the strips of the yak hair. This is the width of the loom that it's made. This was actually in the area of called Mustan in Nepal, which was a Tibetan area as well, part of the Tibetan Empire. They have their guard dogs, the Tibetan Mastiffs that the Tibetans and Mongolians use. There's increasing use of guard dogs now for herders or livestock people, ranchers in America. In Tibet, they milk the yaks, but they also milk the sheep. This is Tibetan Nomads at 15,000 feet, and they're milking the sheep. You see the tent behind them. Of course, it looks like, a desert here, but you have to remember this is kind of like the barnyard right around the tent where the animals are brought back to every, evening, and they're milked in the morning and evening. So that's why there's no grass right there. But it's also at 15,000 feet. There isn't that much lush grass anyway. Now let's move to a little bit about the description of Mongolia. Mongolia really is a horse culture. Here is Mongolian herder bringing in his herd of horses. He has this long pole that he puts a noose on it, a lasso to catch the horses. In Mongolia, they milk the horses. Tibetans do not milk horses. Tibetans also do not eat horse meat, but the Mongolians do. Now, the horse milk is made into, Russian word is kumis, fermented mare's milk. It's a bit of an acquired taste. Some people asked me, well, what's fermented mare's milk taste like? And I'd say, well, take some buttermilk and add a little bit of Sprite and then add a little champagne. And that's kind of what fermented mare's milk tastes like. And the Mongolians believe it's healthy for you. It's not real high in alcoholic content, but they believe it's healthy. So I would always drink a lot of it whenever I found it. The Mongolians also milk cattle. This is a photograph of Mongolian herders milking their cattle. An average family may have from 10 to 20 milk cows that they maintain. That's about the number that a family can maintain with their family labor. And when they get more than that, they have to start hiring workers. Mongolians will also milk sheep, especially down in the Gobi Desert, the southern part of the country where the grassland is more suited to sheep and goats, and they can't raise as many cattle. Here they will milk the goats, and they also milk the camels. Here's a baby camel there with their tent. Mongolia has sheep as well, and they are a fat-tailed sheep or a fat rump sheep. The sheep, of course, provide the wool for making the felt to make the tents and other garments that they use. This is a typical grassland, rangeland area in the central part of the country. You see the yurts in the background there, and forest on the ridges with a valley going along here with poplar trees. The photograph on the upper right here is Tibetan nomad women that are weaving yak hair, and it's on this upright loom into a strip that's probably about maybe 10 to 10 inches wide. That's the width of the cloth that they weave that is then sewn into strips to make the tent. This strap on the bottom is a bell strap that is made by the nomads. You see the traditional auspicious sign with 8 knots. You also see that this is not the Nazi swastika. The swastika that is part of Tibetan Buddhism or the Mongolians was used long before Hitler and the Nazis adopted it. But as it's seen on many of the things that you see in Tibet or Mongolia. These items are Tibetan slingshots made by the herders out of yak hair and sheep wool, a utilitarian tool that is still made today by these people for herding their animals, kind of like David and Goliath with his use of his slingshot. And I'm just fascinated at times by the incredible beauty of these locally made utilitarian products that the nomads use, to have that skill yet today to make these items. Mongolians do not make knotted carpets. They do make felt products. All these items on the right are different Mongolian felt carpets or rugs that I have. This one on the bottom was a saddle pad that I had the person make with putting in this eternal knot, which is one of the auspicious symbols. On the left is a simple felt pad that has these designs put on it, and it's on a yak that they're riding the yaks at this yak festival that I went to. These are some of the saddle carpets that are used by Tibetans, both color and black and white, where they They'll have a blanket underneath, and then the carpet, and then the saddle, and then another saddle pad. These saddle carpets are usually made in a pair. This one is not matching on the left. On the right, this is a matching set. And so, of course, I started collecting these rugs and textiles many, many years ago, and have a collection now. My house is full. I should have bought a bigger house. I don't have enough room to put all my rugs and textiles on. I had mentioned before that cowboys and nomads take great pride in their saddles. The picture on the right is an old Tibetan saddle with all this metalwork and gold, I'm not sure if it's gold leaf, but anyway, gold carved into it in these traditional designs. The saddle on the left is from the 13th century. This is a 13th century tree from Mongolia. And there's been little change to this day. You see the evolution in American saddles that have happened really since the Spaniards introduced the saddles in the 1600s, and just remarkable change in saddles in 100 years in the US, partially was because of the change in the shape of the horses. Horses have gotten bigger, fatter. Mongolian horses have not changed very much since the time of Genghis Khan, and the saddles are still shaped very much the same. Of course, summer festivals, I had mentioned, are a key part of nomad culture in both Mongolia and Tibet. This happens to be a summer festival in Mongolia where everybody's on horseback, the children, the women. Here's a man with his child in front of him. Everybody attending there's three main events that are held in Mongolia during the summer. It's horse racing, it's archery, and it's wrestling. Those are called the three manly events. But of course, women are involved in it as well. They often have it's the young girls that are riding the horses in the races. They also do archery, but women do not wrestle. The color photo is Mongolian races, horse races. The top black one is Tibetan. The Mongolians will have different distances that they ride these horses, anywhere from 10 to almost 20 miles, depending on the age of the horse. And they will start at the start line, and then they will trot or walk back to where they start at the finish line. They trot or walk back 10, 15 miles to the start line, turn around and take off at a full gallop for the length of the race, 10, 15, 20 miles. Many of them are children. Well, all the jockeys are children, younger, and many of them are riding bareback that whole way. Again, incredible skill that's taken to do this. The Tibetans have place a lot of importance on horses. You go into any town and there will be a statue of a famous racehorse from the area. It's the racehorses and a wrestler. There's a statue outside of this town with this famous racehorse and this famous wrestler who was from the area. Blue is the ceremonial scarf that they use in Mongolia because of the blue of the sky. So, these cultures that have been using horses for thousands of years still have a lot of rituals related to them, and just the respect that anybody who has trained an important racehorse is then widely recognized and receive medals in that. As I said, in Mongolia, the horses have a special significance, and a family will they have a herd of mares with a stallion or two, and when the stallion dies, they will take the skull of the stallion and put it on one of these rock mounds called an ovo, usually on top of a pass or between watersheds overlooking two different watersheds, and they would place the skull there because of the connection that they believe exists between the people that had that animal and the horse. So there is, a belief in the sacredness of horses and the power that they have. In Mongolia, every summer to start off the summer festival in the capital city of Ulaanbaatar, they take out of the parliament building these banners. There's 9 white banners, and they carry them on 9 white or palomino horses out of the parliament building with Mongolian military, their cavalry in traditional Mongolian cavalry uniform, and paraded out to the national stadium to start the summer festival. So a lot of tradition involved with this that is still maintained to this day. Of course, the champion bronc riders in America are celebrated with the National Finals Rodeo. This is a photograph taken from a area near me, just 40 miles away, Casey, Wyoming, a famous bronc rider called Chris Ledoux, who was also a country western star. Unfortunately, he died early from cancer, but they erected this statue of him representing him making a winning ride in 1976 as a bareback rider. On the right is a statue called the Horse Tamer that was made by a famous Mongolian artist, made into this sculpture right downtown on one of the main areas. And so I always walk by this and amazed at the similarity between these horse riding cultures. And I figure any town or any capital city of a country that's got a man making a good ride on a bronc or a bucking horse is my kind of town. Now, overgrazing is a serious problem in Mongolia. In 1990, when the country became independent, they had about 25 million head of livestock, and that had been stable for for certainly many years before that. With independence and the demise of the state farms and the government control of livestock operations, many people went back to raising livestock just to make a living. There's now close to 70 million animals. And I'm a rangeland ecologist, so I go across the country looking at it through the lens of a rangeland ecologist, and I'm alarmed at the degree of overgrazing you see in the country. In the range science literature, this is a classic fence line contrast. Areas on the left that have been very heavily grazed, yes, it's still green, but the vegetation is different than here on the right where it's been protected by a fence. Actually, it's because they're cutting hay there. But this is one of the biggest challenges that Mongolia is facing these days is the overgrazing. Of course, markets, just like everywhere, are changing the economic situation. There is now increasing demand for meat, increasing demand for cashmere from goats, demand for younger sheep instead of older animals. So it's the markets that are going to drive changes in how livestock are raised. And herders are going to have to start to adapt to these market conditions. The work that I was been involved in, well, for all my life is with livestock, and farmers. Even when I went to Afghanistan as an agricultural officer in the US Embassy, I was trying to convince Afghan farmers not to raise opium poppies. That wasn't very successful, but my work with the herders in Mongolia has revolved around working with them to help them adapt their current system, not totally change it, but to adapt what they're currently doing so that they can take advantage of the markets out there. I had mentioned before that I had a saddle made to take to Mongolia. So it was a way for me to easily connect to the herders and the nomads. They certainly right away they realized, oh, this guy at least he knows how to ride a horse, and gee, he knows a little bit about animals. So gee, maybe he knows a thing or two. This is actually on the right is the picture of the saddle that I had made, custom made to take to Mongolia. You see here is this eternal knot, which is one of the 8 auspicious signs for Mongolians. And this is a felt carpet that has that design on it. So I had my saddle maker carve that eternal knot onto the seat of my saddle. And there's a photograph of me in traditional Mongolian gear with a little girl at a nomad camp. So I find this photo quite interesting. What we have here is down on the edge of the Gobi Desert. You can see the grassland behind. This is kind of like the main trail or main road going from north to south across the desert. And here's this Mongolian herder with a cell phone. Everybody in Mongolia's got a cell phone. So this is an incredible technology. They can now talk to their neighbors or their relatives in the city to find out what the market prices are, and how we can use systems to develop so they can track when rainfall is coming, they know when there's going to be snowstorms and that. So modern technology is great. We all have phones, and I think one time I'd heard that Mongolia has the greatest percentage of Facebook users per total population of any country in Asia. So it's a great technology that we can be using. Of course, the future is going to be dependent on the children. in both Tibet and Mongolia. Many of the nomads, are moving to the city because of better healthcare, better education, easier life. But yet they still maintain a connection with their relatives who are full-time herders. This is actually a nomad camp that I was staying at, and these were some little girl from the city come visit her relatives for the summer and ride horse and that. But I think it kind of captures, here's this little city girl with her sandals and her sunglasses on and her dress out there in the nomad camp, so that there is this connection between even the urban city dwellers in Mongolia with their nomadic heritage. This was a photograph I took in 2019 when I was going to this yak festival in the central part of Mongolia. And I had my saddles. This is an old saddle that I used. I took to Mongolia. I took to Tibet when I was hunting wild yaks, used it because I knew I was going to be riding horseback. And I had this and another old saddle with me, and my newer saddle in the back of the van that I was traveling, going off to look at some of these deer stones. So I saw this group of herders coming on the road. So I stopped and started talking to them and asked them where they were going, or they were going to the yak festival in a couple of days. And we were talking about the horses. And I asked them if they'd ever seen a American cowboy saddle before. No, man. Oh, you got one? So I took my saddles out and we sat there on the ground for an hour, just, looking at saddles, talking about stuff. Oh man, they wanted to trade me, their old beat up Mongolian saddle for mine, but I wasn't going for it. But I like this photograph because he's looking right at the camera. He's looking right at me. But I think it also portrays how these different cultures, the cowboys of North America and the Mongolian herders, have this connection over animals and over horses and the gear that we use. And you can bridge this culture by these things and to create really a smaller world and an understanding of both of our cultures. So what can we learn from Tibetan and Mongolian herders? Well, of course, they have a pastoral history going back thousands of years, but they also have a reverence for the land. This is one of these sacred pile of stones that's in between different mountain passes. And when you're driving on the road, you usually stop at this place and circumambulate it for 3 times. Maybe you put a little blue prayer flag or silk scarf on it just to give thanks for a good journey and good wishes in the future. But there is this sense of sacred that they have for the land. Of course, now they have too many animals. They need to get back to raising the animals to what the stocking capacity is, but still this sense of sacred they have. And the fact that they were mobile, and moved. There's a lot of things that we can still learn from this 1,000-year-old herding culture. Close it with another NASA satellite interpretation of the Tibetan plateau that we see there in the Gobi Desert and Mongolia. I show this just to kind of give you a sense of the land that we're dealing with, and also to get away from these political boundaries that humans have imposed on ourselves, and the need to start looking at the land from a watershed aspect. Tibetan wild ass or Tibetan wild yaks don't need a visa to move from one county to another or one country to another. Blackneck cranes don't need passport or visas to migrate from their summer areas in Mongolia down to India. So we need to start looking at the land in terms of a watershed perspective, I think, as well. So that's what I have to say about these 2 different cultures, Mongolia and Tibet. This is my email address and my website, and also have a virtual bookstore where I've self-published a lot of books. I've set my books so that anybody can go to that, and you can look at all the books online. You don't even have to buy them. Anyway, a lot of other photographs there. So that is my presentation.
Dan, thank you very much. That was excellent. You ended on a topic I'd like to have you expand on just a little bit. In this country, there's a great conflict between the developers of minerals, lumbering, all the commercial interests, and the idea of respect for the land. Okay, that has been a great conflict. As Mongolia has become, or Tibet, that matter of fact, as part of China, as they have changed their political world, have they experienced that as well?
Certainly, yes. I mean, in Mongolia, you see this with the gold mining taking place. Money driving it, right? Where gold mining, oftentimes companies are people that are politically oriented, have connections. They're able to get some kind of a permit to come into an area without even notifying the local people, and suddenly show up with bulldozers and start ripping up the land. And the herders come out there and say, "Hey, this is our land. What's going on here?" And then the security guys come in with their helicopters. So yes, it is a problem, and there is efforts being made to try to develop group, organize the herders into groups so that they get better tenure over some of this land, and so that it is respected. Mongolians, they talk about well, there's a project. It was called the Green Gold Project that was funded by the Swiss government, and actually it was trying to say, look, the pastures and the grasslands, this is our green gold. This is our future. We can't just be concerned about short-term income. And the same is happening in Tibet. There's a lot of areas in Tibet that remind in that as well. So, the internet has allowed, it's very difficult to keep things secret now, although harder, it's easier in Tibet. But I mean, everybody's got a cell phone, everybody's got photos and that. So the information gets out there much easier.
Okay, open up for questions. Lynn, you're on.
Great presentation. Thank you. Very wonderful photos. A couple of photos where the animals were lined up shoulder to shoulder to be milked. It looked as though perhaps they were eating from a trough. Was that so? And
No.
if so, they were not?
No, they're just tied head to head. They have a special slip knot, like a half hitch. They just tie them up head to head. They're not eating anything.
Uh-huh. And what would those animals eat? It looked pretty barren to me.
Well, I mentioned that right around that campsite where they are being milked, that's kind of like the barnyard. So, I mean, they're taken out during the day further away for grazing.
Thank you.
Okay, other questions, comments? Roger, you're on. I unmuted you.
I noticed in a couple of the pictures of the herders up front in the background, there were cars. In addition to owning cell phones, do many of them own automobiles?
Yes, certainly in Mongolia, this is the big change. You see, when I first went to the country and first went to Mongolia in 1992, you saw there'd be a few old Russian motorcycles and maybe a Russian Jeep that, maybe one person in kind of in a valley might have one. Now, most herders have access to a motorcycle and a car. They now move camp with a vehicle, put supplies into the back of a truck. So vehicles are much more prevalent now. In fact, one of the biggest problems in the capital city of Ulaanbaatar is traffic jams.
Okay.
Thank you.
Lynn?
Yeah, hi, Dan. I'd like to ask some questions about basically gender relations. You've shown us several different cultures here, and I'm not quite clear which is one, but there's the Tibetan culture, the Mongolian culture, and then Bhutan. And in any of those, do women inherit livestock? And in which culture would you rather be if you were born a woman?
Yes, the women do inherit livestock. Women also do much of the work related to taking care of the animals in both Nepal and both Tibet and Mongolia. It's the women that are doing most of the milking. The men are off herding. The women certainly have a very heavy workload in the nomad areas, but the women do inherit livestock. And will often, when they are married, they will be given animals to take with them. And if they end up divorcing, they can take their animals back. If I was to be reborn in any of these places right now, I think I'd rather be reborn in Mongolia, because the situation in Tibet, the Chinese have have settled all Tibetan nomads. In fact, I just recently reviewed a new book wrote an article, a book review of this book that just came out for the journal Inter-Asia, talking about the settling down of Tibetan nomads. So if I was to be reborn now, I'd want to be it in Mongolia.
Question on the chat. What is the average family size and lifespan for the nomads?
Okay, I mean, if you can make it, up to 6, 7, 8 years of age, you're going to do pretty well. You do see a lot of older people. I mean, they eat healthy. It's not like the poverty-stricken people of Bangladesh or India. So they have a lot of milk products and meat. There's not as much sickness because it's cold. Average family size, 3 to 4 to more probably. Of course, there is various birth control measures are available in all of the. China, of course, tries to limit the population. With nomads, it was to 2. Mongolia, it's not as much controlled. But with the education, people are want to have smaller families. Interesting fact that in Mongolia in 1990, they had one of the highest literacy rates in the world because of the Russian influence, and also one of the lowest maternal mortality rates in the world, just because of the healthcare system that Mongolia had because of years of Russian influence and Russian support.
Gabriel, do you have a question?
I do.
Yes, I was going to follow up on the family thing. I mean, I know in Tibet that mostly they practice polyandry, where a number of brothers will marry one woman and one of the brothers will go off and be the herder and the others stay at home. But I don't know if that's true in Mongolia as well.
Not as common as it is. I mean, very seldom do you hear of it in Mongolia that I'm aware of. So more common in Tibet.
Juanita, you had a question.
Yeah, you brought up the China-Tibet issue, and I just wondered if you could expand a little. What is it that China has in for Tibet other than just races? And is it their resources?
Well, a lot of it is, we go on all day about this, but biggest thing is that the land area, right? I mean, a huge chunk of country out there that the Chinese believe is theirs, belongs to them. Of course, it borders then India and that. So just having the control of that area of land is important. The other aspect is Han Chinese have never understood nomads. That's why they built the Chinese Wall years ago, the Great Wall, right? So Han Chinese have been a farming centric culture. They've never understood herders and nomads. And so the settling down of nomads in Inner Mongolia and with the Kazakhs in Western China and with the Tibetans, it is, it's couched in terms of, to control environmental degradation. But it's a political control movement as well, to control the population, I think.
What percentage of the population is nomadic in these areas, Mongolia?
Okay, I'll give you an example from Mongolia. Mongolia total population is about 3 million in Mongolia. 1.5 million people live in Ulaanbaatar, the capital city. There's only about 150,000 full-time herder households in Mongolia. So it's a fairly small population that are actually full-time herders, but yet very important to the culture, to the economy, and politically now by having the land and animals.
Well, and it's certainly a larger proportion than our agriculture or community, particularly the grazing community, I think, nowadays.
Dan, are the nomads organized into tribes at all? Do they have self-government? How does that work?
In Mongolia, there's different, they talk about Mongolians, there's the Halka, there's different tribes in Mongolia. And usually what it is now, they're organized into traditionally would have been called, they call it a hotdao, which is kind of like a large extended family in an area. Now they're organizing these groups into like a user group, which is kind of formalized, that allows them to come up with grazing plans for an area. And so there is, different tribes in Tibet. You have different cultural areas. They're all Tibetan, but yet they have their own dialect. There's Amdo, there's Kampa, there's in the West. So you have the different tribal organizations, you might say, across the Tibetan plateau as well.
Okay, Lynn, you had a question?
Mhm. I didn't see in your photos snow on the ground. What would be the average rainfall, or how much moisture do those areas get?
Well, it varies. In Mongolia, you have the Gobi Desert in the south, which is very little rainfall. I mean, maybe certainly less than 8 to 10 inches. In the middle part of the country, where it's more grassland, you have increasing rainfall. And then up in the mountainous areas, you have forests and that, where there's more rainfall, probably up to 25, 30 inches in the mountainous areas. Yes, it's true. I don't have many pictures of the land with snow on it. You do get these periodic severe winters with blizzards and lots of snow, which can decimate herds in both Mongolia and Tibet. Yeah, most of my pictures are taken in the summer, but I've been there in the winter as well.
Judy, you had a question.
Oh, yeah. So what was it about the nomads and the cowboys? What was it that pulled you so much, that made you, want to dedicate a lot of your life to that lifestyle?
Well, I think, having grown up every morning milking cows, I had a certain affinity for cows and animals and horses. And then, starting off as a Peace Corps volunteer in Nepal, where I learned to speak Tibetan, and I thought, wow, this is pretty interesting culture. And then studying range ecology and becoming a rangeland ecologist, I can travel anywhere and, be looking at the grasslands and trying to understand what goes on with the grasslands, and not only the people using them, but also the wildlife using them. So by having a understanding of rangelands, I can delve into both the livestock raising people and their cultures on it and their use of it, as well as the wildlife use of it. Interestingly, I collected a species of grass on the slopes of Mount Everest that was determined to be a new species. So I have a species of grass named after me.
Okay, I thought I saw someone named Ross with his hand up. If I did, I asked him to unmute. If I missed that, I think we lost him. Okay, any last question here before we close out? Juanita, you're back on.
Basically a grasslands question. I know in the American Midwest, I'm thinking about Iowa, where the grazing has changed the grass dramatically. And now they've got this project to allow certain areas to go back to natural. Have you observed that in these other countries as well, where the grasses are not the same?
Yes, I mean, in many parts of Tibet and Mongolia, there has been research where they have fenced off areas that have been grazed and not allowing livestock go in it, so that they can determine how the land responds to less grazing pressure. You see this in this national park where the Prejuvsky's horse, the pictures I had, they don't allow livestock grazing into the core area. And so the rangeland are actually in very good condition. And 10 kilometers away, where there's many more livestock, it has been impacted. So the rangeland in many of these areas is very resilient. Again, it's evolved with livestock grazing over thousands of years, like much of the American Great Plains. And as long as the species composition has not totally changed with proper management and rest, the overgrazed areas can restore naturally. They're resilient.
And other species come in, species of grasses come back?
Well, I mean, if some of these will still be there, you just,
Yeah.
you know, their seed is there. And once you start to let it restore again, then they start to be restored.
Ian, you had a comment or question?
Yeah. In terms of the history of the American cowboy, can you trace that back to the Spanish and the Mexicans? I mean, you know, the entire kind of culture of the cowboy, the caballero, the vaquero.
Yes, yes, certainly. You know, that the Spanish Mexican influence is very, very strong throughout the West. Yes, certainly.
So we have two questions in the chat. Let me ask the first one. How big is a wild yak?
They stand 6 feet tall at the shoulders and will weigh up to a ton.
Okay, so I think of that as comparable to a bison buffalo.
Yeah, not quite as big of a bison, but almost, yes.
Okay. Do the nomads grow crops?
In Tibet, no. Tibet, most of the Tibetan nomads, the reason they're nomads because they're above the area where crops can be grown. Now, some of them will have their winter settlements in areas where they may be able to grow some turnips and root crops, or even have some fields now. Tibetan culture designated between the herders and the farmers, or those that were kind of both, farmer and herder together. Now with Mongolia, very little cropping in Mongolia traditionally. There in the last, you know, with the Russians coming in and trying to develop farms, state farms and that, there was cropping that took place largely of wheat and some potatoes. And some of the nomads now, or the livestock keeping people in Mongolia, are realizing the need to raise oats to put up to turn it into green, to make hay out of it, to keep their animals in the summer. So there is increasing amount of farming, but traditionally nomads in Mongolia and nomads in Tibet did not do any cropping.
Okay, we're heading toward the last question. The kids and cell phones brings you to the idea that we often see, which is the migration of the next generation away from the farms, away from the open lands and into the cities. Would you comment on that for Mongolia, Tibet, and for that matter of fact, Montana and Wyoming?
Well, you know, there, even in Mongolia now, yes, there's better education, kids want to go, but there's an increasing number of people realizing, hey, I want to go back and live out in the countryside. You know, there's traffic jams in Ulaanbaatar. Yes, the healthcare is better, but if we can have healthcare and have good education, I would rather be living out in the countryside. So there's that ideal that a lot of the Mongolians have. I think with Tibet, there's always been a certain, you know, idealization of the nomads were people that, wow, they're out there on their horses, they're out there on their yaks. So there's a certain ideal that people had when you think about Tibetan nomads that is still strong amongst, I mean, even many of these people, it's tragic, the ones that have been settled down, but they say, oh, I'd rather be out there herding. So how do we create opportunities for the herders to still be out there, have good health care, have education, have markets for their produce or their meat products? And the same here in the US. Last fall, I was helping to co-teach a class on issues in agriculture at Casper College. And you know, most of them were ranch or farm kids, and they're looking to continue to be involved in agriculture. How do we create those opportunities? How do you create opportunities to get away from the four big meat packers and sell meat locally and sell animals locally? So, as I said, many of the same challenges that these livestock raising people in Tibet and Mongolia are dealing with are the same as livestock people in the US are dealing with.
Okay, well, Dan, I have to thank you on behalf of all of us for a great talk. And we look forward to having a chance to look at your website and glance at some of the other photo albums you've got there.
Okay.
So thank you, everybody. We'll see you Wednesday at 4, if you want to learn about cybersecurity and what's going on. And
And if-
next Sunday, if you want to learn something about local media.
And Julie Kill, if you want to see more pictures of my museum, send me an email. I can send you pictures.
Okay,
All right.
bye all.
Thank you.